Thank you for the intro. Okay, so today we're going to talk about state management with ngrx, and I just wanted to maybe do a show of hands, like who here has worked with ngrx? Cool, there's a few hands here. I guess it's like maybe 20–30% of the room, which is awesome. But we're not going to start with this. We're going to start with Zach. Does everyone here know who Zach is? Yeah? Zach, are you here? Thank you. So I just want to thank you, Zach, for organizing this and for putting this together. I'm super happy to be here. It's really a truly unique conference. And yeah, thank you for having me. And here you can see a picture of a tweet that Zach has done like a year ago when we met at NG Vikings. And basically we mentored together at NG Girls. And then after that, we kept on talking on Twitter, and Zach was kind of talking about this idea of like running a conference that's a bit more diverse than your usual 20% female speakers kind of conference. And I'm super excited to be here and super excited to see it happen. Cool, so my name is Simona Cotin. I work as a cloud developer advocate at Microsoft. And if you want to chat about JavaScript, Angular, or anything Azure, I'm here to answer any of your questions or even just, I don't know, whatever, talk, chat. And you can find me on Twitter at Simona_Cotin. And as I mentioned, we're going to talk about ngrx. And my friend here, Mark, he mentioned that if I have cats in my presentation, my talk is going to be great. So my job here is done. Cool. So while I was thinking about this talk, I was like, what do I love about ngrx? Because obviously, I cannot really talk about something if I'm not actually excited about it. And one of the things that stuck with me was the fact that as a developer, I like to structure things. I love to put things in a box, to label them, and to know that I can retrieve them and that I have a form for them. I'm also a huge fan of patterns. So I want to be able to, again, recognize what's happening. And yeah, like, why is that? Why do we like structure? Why do we like patterns? Well, because we want to be able to recognize everything that we're seeing, everything that we've already seen. And that enables us, in a way, to make decisions faster. And it also gives us a sense of comfort. So it's like you step back, and you're like, I've got this. This is happening. This is good. So then how do we take that to state management? Like, how do we get from comfort to ngrx? Well, if we look at an Angular application, the core part of an Angular application is basically a component. And what does a component do? Well, it can initialize state, and it can request data from the server, and it can update state to reflect data from the server. And I can just kind of say blah, blah here, but like, I'm going to continue. So it reacts to events that change the state, and it updates the state to reflect user interaction. And it does a lot of things, right? It also like takes care of rendering stuff. And again, a lot of things. And this is fine. This is great. This is perfect when you work in a small team. Or not even when you're in a small team, because we all know Instagram, right? Which was a 40-people startup, and they did huge things. So it doesn't matter if it's a small team, but definitely if you're working on an application that has a small number of components that are not communicating heavily, that's fine. But what happens when we're building large applications that are actually managing a lot of state changes and that are communicating heavily, like maybe trading apps? You have a lot of state mutation there or updates there. So it becomes very crowded when you have all of that, right? Cat. And you'd think that, oh, this is fine. I love having all this happening at the same time. This is great. But is it really? So what happened next? Like, we started making a bit of space. And the way we created that was by kind of separating this smart components from presentation components. And I feel much more comfortable saying DOM components because it's kind of the opposite. But basically, what smart components do is they help you manage state. So we have this component that will be able to maybe retrieve data, handle some behavior, but it definitely doesn't have a lot of markdown. And then you have the presentation component, which takes care of showing your user stuff. So one of the things like one of the questions that smart components answer is how things work. Whereas the presentation or DOM components, they're like, how do things look like? And that's great. Like, we have a pattern. This is perfect. Can we do better, though? I bet we can. So this is a very simple representation of our application, where basically the green rectangles are just like events that are outside of your application. And then you have the 3 magenta, or I don't know if that violet, are maybe your modules, where basically the blue dots are your state, and you also have functions, the rectangles there. So you have events coming in, and then you have methods that respond to those events, and then those events are changing state, and that's happening in all your smart components, right? And that's still like in many places of your application. What about this? Does this look like this? We've just grouped there all of our events, and we've added there some of the methods that are changing our state in our application. And now we have our components that are just delegating our state management. Doesn't that sound good? Yeah? Maybe? No? Woo? Cool. So I think that's exciting. I like that. I didn't see any of you do that. And that's what we call a store. And how do we retrieve data from the store? Well, that's easy. We have our component, and we have our store that has all of our data, all of our state. And what we do here is basically we select a slice from our store, from our state, and we do that by calling the select method on the store object. And the cool part is that this is an observable. Wait. This is an observable, which means that whenever our data changes, our component is going to be notified. And we no longer need to poll for changes, we just get updates. How do we change the state? Well, we have to deal with a few terms here, but we have our component, which basically communicates through an action that the state needs to change. And that goes to a reducer, which processes that action. And what happens next is that it creates new state for us. And then that is being returned to the component. So I have this cool animation here that just shows the flow of the data and the behavior. And I think that's cool. That's relaxing. We have how many patterns, new patterns here? Like, we have this from the component that did everything, and it was hard to recognize, like, this component does this, and you have a lot of options there. You now are able to identify, like, this component is dealing with state, is delegating state, and this component is in charge of presenting my data, showing my data. And moreover, my state will always be in this place, and I'm using this type of component to basically trigger state changes. And these are some patterns that I think are very important, and it's easy to communicate within a team, no matter the size. It's like a contract. So there's a name for this. It actually, in the beginning, it was the Flux pattern. It was implemented. Redux is an implementation of the Flux pattern that is very used in React, and it's basically a predictable state container for JavaScript applications. And Redux has some core principles. So you have a single source of truth for your state. Your state is read-only, so whenever we're updating state, we're basically creating a copy of the state, and we're adding whatever is new. And we're doing that by using pure functions. Are you guys familiar with pure functions? Yeah, there's a few hands there. Okay, cool. So what's our single source of truth, or how does our state look like in our application? Well, it's a big object, or a small one, depending on your state, but it's just a JSON object. It's just as simple as that. I've struggled whenever I came to the slide to explain stuff because there's nothing to explain. We all know what a JSON object is. The other concept that's very important is actions, and action is, again, just an object. And here we have a bit of structure because we definitely need to define a type for our action. And this is basically describing the intention, what do we want to do, how do we want to change the state. And then you can send some data with your action, and that's basically the payload object. But that's not mandatory. That's optional. You can imagine, like, for example, you're just retrieving a list of to-dos, and you don't need any data there. You're not changing state. You're just retrieving it. And finally, reducers are just a function of your previous state and your action. And what you're doing here is you're just switching based on the action type and generating new state, returning new state, updating your application state. And the reducers, what's cool about reducers is that they're pure functions, which means that given the same input, you're basically always going to return the same output. And you can recognize a pure function by just looking at it. Again, patterns. You're going to have the same, a reducer or a pure function always has to have some input and always needs to return something. So if you don't have those two elements, then you're not looking at a pure function. And then obviously, if you're calling other functions from your function, they have to be pure as well, so that your function stays pure. Cool, but like, what's in it for me? Did you guys know this acronym? I've learned it recently, and I'm super happy about it. No? It's like, WIFM. Did I pronounce that correctly? So what do we get? We get patterns. We get a nice way, a contract to communicate with our team. We also get centralized state, and that's easy to reason about. Like, you have your state, all your state in a single place. That's perfect. That's awesome. We get better testability because our state is now being changed by using pure functions, and those are super easy to test. It's like you have this input, and you'll always get this result, and that's it. And finally, you get better tooling and an ecosystem of libraries. And I'm going to come back to this later, but basically we have a DevTools extension that is really cool with Redux. So then you're going to ask, like, what about Angular? Well, we already know the answer to that. We have ngrx, which is basically a Redux implementation in Angular. It's a re-implementation that takes advantage of all the Rx goodness that Tracy has just showed us. And so ngrx is a collection of libraries that help with state management in Angular. I think I don't have enough cats. And if you go to the GitHub page, you're going to see all these packages. And there's a few which are very important. So if you want to have state management, you're going to use the store package, which is the reimplementation of Redux. And then you have the effects package, which basically help you deal with side effects. And you're going to use effects if you want to, like whenever you're making HTTP requests, for example. There's also a neat integration between ngrx and the router. And you do need the DevTools to have the powerful debugging, as well as entity. Well, you can or you cannot. You can use that one, or you can just choose not to. But in fact, it helps you reduce some of the boilerplate of your CRUD operation. So that would be similar to the resource that we had in AngularJS, which I hope some of you are familiar with. And then schematics, woohoo! Broco, that help you basically create or get started with creating a store and generating some of the boilerplate for reducers. So what's in it for me? Well, the same things that we had with Redux, powered by Angular. So let's just maybe I'm going to show you a very quick demo with a very basic application. And get you started with ngrx. So this is our super amazing application, and this is my on my list on a daily basis, like go to bed early. That's what Brad mentioned, right? He told us that we should sleep more. So this is the application. I'm just clicking add, and you can add a lot of items here, and then you can toggle and untoggle this item. Cool, so this doesn't look very strange at all. And then if we go to our code, so basically to get started with this application, I just installed the schematics and used the store schematic to generate my store and to add all of that to my Angular application. So the first thing that I'm not going to show you this right now, but it's easy to get started. And the first thing that we're going to look into is our app module, where we've imported our store module and our dev modules, and our reducers, which I'm going to show in a bit. And then in our imports, we are initializing our store module, and we are just adding our reducers. And if we're depending on whether we're in production mode or in development mode, we're going to run the DevTools or not. And then if we go to our reducers, and basically this is where the meat is, here I have our actions, and this is a custom type. It's not the ngrx way per se, but this is the simplest way, or the simplest way I've seen doing. Where basically I'm just defining my action to have like the type and the payload. I'm defining a type for that, and then in my reducer, I am just taking my previous state and the action, and then I'm switching based on whether I've added a new item in my to-do list or I've toggled whether it's completed or not. And a very important thing here is that I am creating a new state. So as you can see here, I am just creating a new array where I'm copying the old state and I'm adding a new object onto that. And by using the map method, I'm doing the same. Map is immutable, so I'm just creating a new object here, and I am like toggling the completed property. And in our component, the first thing that I'm doing in my constructor, I'm just, as you've seen earlier, I'm selecting the state from our store here, and then I'm reacting to the add method, or implementing the add to do method, which is basically just dispatching an action onto our store. And we're saying, please add this new to do item or toggle this to do item. And this is everything in the code, like the HTML method, the HTML template is not something, yeah, we have toggle here, and that's pretty much an add to do. Cool, but the best part now, here comes the DevTools. And I'm going to maximize this. Okay, so as I'm adding a new element, you're going to see on the right-hand side, or your left-hand side, the actions that I'm dispatching. And I can do that forever, and I can just complete, well, I shouldn't have added the same action. But what we can do next is inspect these actions and see things like, what is my, can you see that? I'm not sure. Yeah, I can increase that. What was the action that I've just dispatched? How does it look like? This is very similar to what we've seen in the code. And then you can also see the current state, and this is not very interesting because it's just one object, but I can go ahead and see, like, maybe after a few actions have been dispatched, this is how my state looks like. I can also see a diff between the previous state and the current state, and there's nice ways of visualizing your state. You can use this is the inspector, and then you can also use like a chart. And again, this is nice. Like if I'm adding a new object here, it's gonna nicely add a new node to my graph. And this is a very simple application, so there's not much to see here. But when you're gonna have complex application, this is gonna look much more interesting. But one of my favorite features here is not the ability to see all the actions that I'm just running in my browser, but it's actually the ability to import state and play it back. And you can imagine in production, you have a bug, you have an error, and then you are just sending back to your server the current state of the application, and then you can just say, I want to import this in my DevTools, and just a sec. And here you're going to see that I've just imported a new state. These are new items in our application, and I can go ahead and replay that. And this is just going to show me everything that our user has done until the moment they hit the error. So we can debug that. And that's like maybe 90% of what we're doing as developers, right? Debugging stuff. So I think this is very powerful. That's why time travel debugging is so cool. So that was the quick demo. And one of the questions that I get very often is like, why would I use ngrx? It's a lot of, like, I have to change the way I think. There's some boilerplate there. I have to repeat some of the code. I'm not sure if I like it. Well, you don't necessarily have to use it. But if you're building applications that are definitely like they have a lot of state updates, like trading apps or network data monitoring, there, ngrx makes a lot of sense. And Mark here was mentioning that he built an application where he had to basically go through a lot of forms and kind of store those intermediate steps. And it's super cool to do that with ngrx. It really helps you. But it's also okay not to have state management, not to have a library that does that. One thing that stuck with me from a talk of Victor Savkin is careful thinking cannot be replaced by a library. And his message here is basically you have to be intentional about state management. You don't have to use a library, but you have to have a strategy. You have to have the bigger picture and make sure that you're doing the right thing. So then I recommend you check out the narwhal extensions as well, which is like something that will help you get started very quickly with ngrx. And I'm going to leave you with these happy thoughts. You should be using ngrx if you want to have simpler state management, and if you want to have better testability and better tooling, and if you love time travel debugging. And finally, I want to thank Dominic, who helped me with a lot of reviews for my slides and gave me a lot of useful feedback, and Mark for sharing his experience with me. That's it.